Before I got heavily into rail, when I was working at the Nosman firm on public-private partnerships, I did a lot of toll road work. And we worked on these P3s for privatization of toll roads in various states around the country. We got to work in Texas. And I did work on the I-35 toll lanes, but please don't blame me. Every time I come down here, I think, oh my gosh, what a nightmare. So, let me see if I can get my slides going. So this is what I'm always required to say. Nothing that I say as a member here of the STB should be taken as an opinion of the board or of any of its members. And also nothing I say should be interpreted as expressing an opinion on any matter that is currently pending or might be pending in the future. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Surface Transportation Board, let me give you a little background. First of all, we are not the National Safety Transportation Board. We're confused with them all the time. Our authorizing statute provides that the board is an independent establishment of the United States government. That's what it says in the statute. And it provides that we have 5 members that are all appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and then we have a chairman of those 5 members who is appointed by the president. And not more than 3 members of the 5 can be a member of any can be appointed from the same political party. And that's true of most regulatory agencies of the government. So currently we have 4 members, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, but I am here to say, I've said it before, I think we all will say it, we are probably the most nonpartisan board in the government because we're dealing with disputes between some of the largest companies in the country and some of the largest railroads. And, you know, when you get Archer Daniels Midland in a spat with BNSF, it's hard to tell who the Republicans and the Democrats are in the room. So, anyway. We are a successor to the Interstate Commerce Commission, which in fact was the very first regulatory agency created in the United States during the presidency of Grover Cleveland in 1887. But then, it's important to know that the ICC was, in fact, itself created to confront the problems of the rise of monopolies of the railroads at the end of the 19th century. And it eventually was given quite extensive rate-making jurisdiction, which was put to use by another president. This is my favorite cartoon of Teddy Roosevelt running down the track carrying a big stick. Well, we think about that sometimes. You get fast forward 100 years and the Staggers Act comes along in 1980, which greatly reformed the ICC and its regulatory scheme and gave the railroads much freer rein to establish their own rates. And then in 1996, the ICC was actually abolished under something called the ICC Termination Act, affectionately known as ICTA, because that same act created the Surface Transportation Board, and so some, but not all of the powers of the ICC were given to the Surface Transportation Board, and some of its powers were also given to other agencies. So what is it that we actually do? The board regulates the economic affairs of railroads. That's how we describe what it is we do. And this typically involves issues relating to licensing, disputes between railroads and shippers or between railroads. Other agencies like the FRA and the NTSB, they deal primarily with safety issues. Safety does come under our jurisdiction a little bit, particularly when we're doing environmental reviews. But what is actually meant by economic regulation? So our current chair, Patrick Fuchs, recently described it this way, which I think is the best way I've ever heard it described. First, we break down barriers to economic growth and eliminate patchwork regulations. There's this thing called preemption. The states can't regulate where we regulate. And we facilitate a nationally connected supply chain. And indeed, it's an internationally connected supply chain. Secondly, we try to protect and advance competition, and this is under our merger and access cases. And thirdly, we ensure that manufacturers, farmers, energy producers, and others can access an economically viable rail system on reasonable terms, reasonable rates, reasonable practices, and appropriate services. And we have a number of important tools that help us accomplish these goals. Now, I'm going to describe these for you, and they implicate certain pending cases. I will tell you about the cases very briefly, but I'm not going to take any, obviously, questions on them, and I'd get in a lot of trouble if I commented on them. First of all, we license railroads. And pending license matter that is here in the state of Texas is the proposed new crossing over the Rio Grande at Eagle Pass. It's the Green Eagle project. We just recently issued a draft environmental impact statement for it, and the comments are due by May 5th. They actually had to go down in the river and check out mussels and other things that apparently were there. This project does include a new rail bridge, plus actually a new truck bridge right next to the rail bridge. And it'll be about 3 miles upriver from the existing UP International Bridge. And on the Mexican side of the border, this project is actually going to connect to about 18 miles of track going down to the Ferromex Rio Escondido rail yard. We do not have anything to do with anything beyond the middle of the Rio Grande River. A number of years ago, we also accepted jurisdiction over the high-speed rail, proposed high-speed rail end from Dallas to Houston, and we determined that it was, notwithstanding the fact it was entirely within Texas, that it was part of the interstate railroad system because at one end it connects to Amtrak in Dallas, another Amtrak line in Houston, and they have interticketing. So we felt that was enough to bring it within our jurisdiction. And we have another licensing decision, not in Texas, this one is in Utah, which is currently pending before the Supreme Court. We don't often have cases that go to the Supreme Court. But this concerned an approval by the board in 2021, before I was there, of a rail line in Utah, short line, that would carry oil out of the Uinta Basin up to the UP line and then across Colorado and down to refineries in the Gulf. The board's decision was actually reversed by the Court of Appeals on environmental grounds. They said that we ought to have considered the impact of burning that oil on communities in the Gulf. And that is the subject of the Supreme Court case. What factors, how far down the road do you have to consider environmental impacts when you're looking at a rail project? So we also have sole jurisdiction over railroad mergers. You don't go to the Justice Department when you got a railroad merger. And so 2 years ago, we had extensive proceedings on the proposed merger of Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern. And CP's interest in Kansas City Southern was, of course, their extensive operations that they owned, now it's jointly owned, in Mexico. But it was the first merger of two Class I railroads that we had looked at in over 20 years. And it created this first transcontinental railroad connecting Mexico, the United States, and Canada. It crosses the border at Laredo, where they have just opened a new bridge, and they named it in honor of their former CEO, Patrick Ottensmeyer. We also resolve disputes between shippers and freight railroads. 22-23, we spent a lot of time dealing with what was then a very historic service crisis related to a variety of supply chain issues. The railroads were all bunched up, and you had all these ships lined up at the ports. I mean, we really had a mess on our hands. And then last year, we held a major hearing to examine why it is our railroads really haven't grown in the last 20 years. They're very, very healthy. They're making lots and lots of money, but they haven't grown in terms of how much they're carrying. And more disturbingly, they continue to lose market share to trucking. So we took a hard look at that. And then finally, we don't set rates, but we do rule on the reasonableness of rates and service conditions under certain circumstances where complaints are brought by shippers. Happily, we haven't had a rate case since I've been on the board. My term is up in December, and I have my fingers crossed. They're a nightmare, but, somebody's got to do it. So, finally, we have very important responsibilities with respect to passenger rail. Our jurisdiction includes investigations into Amtrak's on-time performance. This is a map of its current system. And we are reviewing delays at the request of Amtrak on the Sunset Limited, which serves Houston and San Antonio on a line that goes from New Orleans to Los Angeles. We've been working on that for over a year, and we've got briefs that are coming in from both parties, and I think perhaps sometime by the end of the year, the first quarter of next year, we'll have some kind of final decision in that case. We also hear petitions from Amtrak regarding access to Class I railroads, and 2 years ago we held 11 days of hearings, 11 days. I think it was a record. On Amtrak's request to restart service on the Gulf Coast, a line it had previously run but had been suspended after Hurricane Katrina. John Robert Smith can tell you all about that, as can Knox Ross, and he's, I assume, going to speak about that tomorrow. They finally got it settled, and if they had left it up to us, I can guarantee you neither party would have been pleased with the outcome. Most cases, it's better to resolve a case through negotiation. Now, does it help to bring a complaint before a public board and get all the facts out? Yes, it does, but the private settlements are always the best. So now I'm going to talk about a topic that I want to discuss with you, and that is, everybody is nervous about this today. What is the future of Amtrak and passenger rail? And the question I want to ask is it time to rewrite the map? So the recent retirement of Stephen Gardner as CEO of Amtrak, some feel may portend new efforts to change Amtrak's funding, its network, perhaps its structure. Bill Stevens in Trains Magazine even prophesied that the new CEO's marching orders are going to be to dismantle the national network and privatize what's left. I hope that's not the case, but that's what people are, I think he was expressing what people are worried about. Now, those of us who have been around the block a time or two know that any such effort wouldn't be the first time somebody had tried to privatize Amtrak or put it out of existence. Some have been trying to kill it off from literally its very inception. Amtrak was created out of the financial crisis of the freight railroads in the 1960s, when many were on the verge or were going bankrupt. And taking the passenger service responsibilities off of the freight railroads was seen as a way of helping relieve some of their financial distress. They did not make money running passenger trains, but still today, people expect that Amtrak should make money. Clearly they didn't, so they put it all into Amtrak. And what they did is they cobbled together from all the passenger routes that had previously been run by the private railroads. They put together kind of a pared down system of long distance lines, and that's what remains. And then Amtrak, of course, later assumed the ownership, actually, as well as the operation of passenger trains on the Northeast Corridor. And that was bought out of the bankruptcy of Penn Central and some others. So Amtrak has survived periodic calls to privatize the NEC, most of which it owns. So it's got these big assets, and it does operate profitably on the NEC. But when I say profitably, it's what they call it, it's above the rail. The operations are profitable. If you take into account the amount of capital that has to go into preserving and upgrading those lines, no, there's no profit. But at least the operations are profitable. So it might be time to consider what we want to do in the future to meet today's transportation needs, short of selling Amtrak off for its parts, letting it file for bankruptcy. What are we going to do with Amtrak in the future? By the way, when I worked at the FRA in the Obama administration. When I walked into my office as chief counsel, that was my first job, I had a set of books on my desk, which were all the memos that described the implications of an Amtrak bankruptcy. And they were all really ugly. So they decided not to do it. And as I mentioned, it's worth, I think, noting again that Amtrak's long-distance routes are a remnant of a much more extensive passenger train transportation system that was operated by the freight railroads prior to 1970. And most of these lines were inaugurated long before the interstate highway system and long before people started flying from coast to coast on airplanes. And some of these routes, unfortunately, at least in my mind, is my personal opinion, they remain largely unchanged to this day. They often bypass cities that were only a dot on the map at the time. One was Phoenix, one was Denver. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But today, they're some of our most important destinations. So, to put a fine point on this, I'll explain what this is. If you wanted to travel today from Los Angeles to Denver, which I did a couple of years ago, I was in San Bernardino, I couldn't get a flight because the airline had melted down, and I said, oh great, I'll just go over the San Bernardino station and hop on the train to Denver, and then I found out I could not do that. If you want to go from LA to Denver, you have to travel first up to San Francisco and get on the Zephyr because the Southwest chief doesn't go there. And this is because, and I discovered this looking at this map, this is an 1899 map of the state of Colorado, which hangs in my dining room. And I was looking at this, and I was trying to figure out why, the chief doesn't go to Denver. Well, the reason it doesn't go to Denver is that the Santa Fe Railroad, its predecessor, in 1899, came up over the Raton Pass from New Mexico and went up here to La Junta. And it does that today. Now, in 1899, that made a lot of sense because all that cattle was being driven up from Texas to the yards in La Junta, or beyond there, the yards in Dodge City, where they still exist today. But that's why the Santa Fe chief didn't go to Denver. I mean, there are other reasons, too. They had lost a fight with the Denver and Rio Grande about access first over the Raton Pass, and then there was a big, literally a firefight over the Royal Gorge. But we're living with that today. It doesn't make any sense, right? You wouldn't do that if you were going to do it today. I mean, I like the hunt. I mean, it's interesting. Bent's Old Fort is there, you know, it's the Arkansas River. But you would think people from LA might want to get to Denver. So skipping forward, I think a good place for us to start thinking about the future of Amtrak is Federal Railroad Administration recently issued what's called the Amtrak Daily Long Distance Service Study. It was published in January. The entire study plus a lot of very interesting appendices are on their website. It was, FRA didn't do this on its own. It was mandated by Congress in the IIJA in 2021. The result is that it has suggested a number of new routes that would ultimately actually double the long-distance network of Amtrak. So it's important, and this is the point I want to make. Long-distance service is defined in statute. It's a line that's more than 750 miles. And only if it's more than 750 miles does Congress appropriate a subsidy for it through its annual grant to Amtrak. If it is under 750 miles, it has to be supported by the states or local governments. So we have these two totally different kind of systems. Now, the study did evaluate also the potential restoration of daily intercity lines that presently occur on a non-daily basis or have been discontinued. One is the Cardinal, and I can't remember the other one, maybe. Yeah, the Sunset. But what they also did is they looked at travel information that came out of federal highways to see, you know, what cities were the big magnets for each other. And so they looked at new long-distance routes, and they were told to particularly look at, and here we go back to the future again, look at routes in service as of 1971, but were not continued by Amtrak. They were notably not tasked with proposing changes to the existing long-distance services. So there were 15 new routes proposed by the study, and it includes 61 cities or locations that are not currently served. And these do connect these cities with smaller rural communities, which has been a key service of the long-distance lines since they were created. And our friends here from the Rail Passenger Association talk about that all the time. And indeed, it's the service to the rural communities that I think has kept it alive, because of the Republican delegations from out west, even though some of their friends in the east want to just, you know, destroy Amtrak, they always come in and say, no, we're going to try and save it. Now, I think one of the really interesting things about this map, look at Dallas. Under this map, Dallas is the new Chicago. All the trains used to go through Chicago. I'm from Chicago. I thought that was cool. But now we've got like 7 of these lines either start in Dallas or go through it. It's really, really interesting. So for you guys here, you know, you're really going to be in the center of things. Nevertheless, the study did point out a couple of weaknesses of this long-distance structure. The average length of passenger travel on long-distance lines is only 600 miles, and that is below the 750-mile cutoff. But most people are only going about 600 miles. Only about 10% actually go from end to end, and of course they enjoy every minute of it. but it's a small proportion. In 2019, and that's the last year that apparently there are statistics, only 1/4 of the trips on long-distance lines were over 750 miles. So it would appear that the most critical service provided by even the long-distance lines is connecting major cities and rural stations within a few hundred miles of each other. But unfortunately, if you have to string them all along a long line, a string of pearls in one long distance line, this creates another problem, which they point out, and that is that the destinations located in the middle of these long routes tend to get served only in the middle of the night. And today, that is the problem faced by Cleveland. That's probably the most notorious example of it. In either direction, east or west, you leave in the middle of the night. And out in the west here, Salt Lake City has that same problem. And they did route analyses and figured out timetables for all of these routes. And they did, by the way, consult with the Class 1s, because to do this, they'd have to get access to the Class 1s. I was at BNSF today with Mr. Tylik, and he said they did sit down with them and talk about how they could improve some of the selections they were making. You can't read this, I understand this, but this is a schedule, and what they show are little moons for the cities that only get served at night in either direction, and they worked really hard to make sure that those weren't major destinations. The other problem, and again this gets into a little bit of what we're doing on the Sunset Limited, is that the longer routes typically encounter much higher rates of operational difficulties, and that leads to overall lower reliability. And you got a 10-minute delay here, another 10-minute delay here, and it just cascades. So it's much harder to stay on time on a long-distance route than on a shorter route. So historically, Congress has funded the deficits, as I said, on the long-distance lines, and has supported the NEC, although the NEC is self-supporting other than for its capital investments. But in more recent years, particularly the last 4 years, but actually going back 10 or 20, the FRA, or the Congress, has really recognized the benefit and the competitive value of corridor services connecting cities that are only a few hours apart. And much of the $66 billion that was appropriated under the IIJA 4 or 5 years ago is focused on projects within inner-city corridors in an effort to enhance alternatives to automobile and air travel. And this is a map of the selections under the state-federal partnership for these corridors through the fiscal year 2022. That's the last selections. There's still a lot more money out there that hopefully will get out the door, and we'll see more corridors. But of course, these corridors, talk to John, Robert, are generally not eligible for operating support. Sometimes you can get a couple of years of startup money, but they have to rely on state and local support, and that has the effect of making states and localities that are going to have to bear the burden of whatever deficits they are very wary of taking on new rail projects. So I think one solution to this problem might be to get rid of this 750-mile demarcation between the subsidized long-distance lines and the corridor routes that only get capital infusion with some exceptions. Another suggestion that has been made by others is to think about breaking up at least some of the long-distance lines into segments that could be covered during daylight hours, and then together having greater frequencies on those segments, but without losing the federal operating support. You look at the success of the Borealis in Minnesota, and that's a new train that runs between Chicago and St. Paul on the same line as the Empire Builder. Empire Builder, like most of the very long-distance lines, is troubled by a lot of delays. The Borealis runs really fast, and everybody loves it. So if we have more Borealises, that would be great. So these are just a few of the ways I think we could try to start thinking about improving our passenger rail network. Most of this that I've talked about is well beyond the jurisdiction of the STB. We might have to get into the issue of, access to the Class 1s, but hopefully most of that could be negotiated. When I was at FRA, we had $10 billion for rail, and I spent most of my time trying to get Amtrak in the states and the Class 1s on the same page with respect to the uses of that money to improve Amtrak service. It wasn't easy, but we got it done. I still remember when I went to talk to the general counsel about not feeling comfortable at federal highways, and he said, well, you can't leave. And I said, what do you mean I can't leave? He said, well, what would you want to do? So I'd worked on high-speed rail in California back in the 90s. That's how long it's been going on. We worked on a business plan that called for the state, with maybe a little federal money, but mostly the state, to build LA to San Francisco and then sell it off, and from the proceeds of that privatization, they could build it out to Sacramento and San Diego. And I think that concept is still in their current plan. But I said, yeah, I'd like to work on high-speed rail. And he said, oh, great. How would you like to be chief counsel of FRA? And I said, I don't know nothing about railroad safety. And he said, oh, don't worry about it. You got a whole group of people there. They figure that out, day in and day out. We just want you to get the money out the door. What I didn't realize when I said, sure, that'd be great, is that they didn't have a grant program in 2015. Joe Szabo, the administrator, later commented it was like doing heart surgery in the middle of a marathon, because we were building the program as we were trying to get the money out the door. They're still having trouble getting the money out the door, but now they got a program and they got a lot of people, and so hopefully we'll see all that $66 billion put to good use. So finally, to quote Bill Stevens again, instead of decimating Amtrak, why not provide the funding and proper oversight required to make passenger rail great again? Flying is a hassle. Driving gridlocked interstates, including the I-35, is a nightmare. And on trips under 500 miles, there's no better way to travel than on a train. That's what the rest of the world does. So those are my thoughts for this evening. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to be able to come here and chat with you about it in what may be the most critical rail state in the Union. I also did a little work in between on the Texas Central Railroad, which I still think is probably the best high-speed rail route in the country. And I still have my fingers crossed for it. This was fun. Thank you, Peter.